All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 30th, 1796, President George Washington asserted executive privilege for the first time in U.S. history, which I know what you're thinking. Most of the things that Washington did were for the first time in presidential history, but nevertheless, this is a big moment because Washington had generally been willing to comply with congressional requests for his documents and papers, but on this day, he drew a line. And of course, this question of executive privilege and oversight of the presidency from Congress and others has lingered ever since, all sorts of contested history and echoes and so forth there. But a very interesting first moment, and here to discuss it, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our special guest for this episode is Lindsay Chervinsky, presidential historian and author of the book The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. Lindsay, thank you for doing this.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you all.
You want to paint the picture of Washington as willing sharer of his documents before we get to Washington as drawer of a line that has lingered ever since?
Absolutely. Well, Washington had a long history of respecting congressional authority going all the way back to the Revolution. He had been very intentional about subverting military authority and his authority in particular to Congress. And while he wasn't quite as subservient once he came into the presidency because he believed really strongly in the importance of a strong executive, he understood the importance of congressional oversight, and that was a really critical role to ensuring there wasn't any bad behavior. So just a couple of years into the presidency, starting in 1790 and then going forward, Congress would create committees to investigate things. The first one in particular that came to Washington's attention was to investigate the really terrible defeat of St. Clair's army out west and the really embarrassing defeat. And so they were trying to figure out sort of what was happening. And Washington actually met with his cabinet and asked, is this something they can do? Should I turn over these papers? And they all agreed that it was a congressional right. He should turn over the papers, and he did. And so this sort of established the pattern that he was willing to comply if the request was appropriate and there was a real need for oversight.
I think that gets at how deliberative Washington was, how aware he was of the fact that every single thing that he did set a precedent and said something about the scope of presidential power and was, responsive to these fears that the president would become a monarch and would have too much power and would disrupt the entire American experiment, that a despot would come take over. So it's fascinating that always seems to be front of mind.
Well, and not just with sort of obvious political choices like congressional oversight, but also every single little detail had to be weighed as a potential precedent. So what he wore, how he interacted with people. Could he host private citizens? Could he attend private events? I mean, every single thing. He was so concerned that he might make a wrong choice. And it sounds, quite hyperbolic today, but that it would be the end of the nation if something went wrong.
Yeah. So, a little more on that dynamic, because it seems like there's sort of three layers maybe of things being negotiated here. I mean, one is the specific matter at hand. We want information about this particular thing that's going on in this moment in time. And then there's like these super big theoretical questions of power and oversight and balance and so forth. And then I assume there's also just like ego, right? And like people who want to lord power over other people or whatever. And so like, were all these things swirling? Did one of those elements kind of take precedence? How do we view this?
100%. So I don't think the ego played as much of a role early on, because he was really attentive to trying to make sure he was finding the right negotiation of balance between Congress and the presidency. But by spring of 1796, he had been in office for almost 8 years. He was tired of it. He wanted to go home. He was subject to a lot of criticism. Some of it was rightly deserved, but some of it was just like lies in the press. And he had a very thin skin. And there were the emergence of the first kind of baby political parties. And so there was an opposition party, and he got a little bit salty about that. And so there's no doubt that that ego piece definitely plays a role in the events in 1796. And his response to Congress really reveals that saltiness.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that he's like, basically, so if you want to impeach me, fine. like I'm more than happy to let this go, or to fight this battle or whatever. I mean, I think that is sort of most presidents today would not take that sort of approach about like an impeachment or a possible impeachment, but he seems very willing to hold his line on this and really like maintain. I think, yes, he's always thinking about presidency, but just like you said, the idea of like, yes, but I'm the president though, like at some point I have to lead or create a standard or create some sort of stops in place so that my position feels real or effective.
Well, and I think that in particular, this decision to assert executive privilege in this moment, it matters that it comes from a moment of foreign policy instead of domestic policy. Lindsay, can you tell us a little bit about why this is the line he draws?
Absolutely. So prior to 1796, Chief Justice John Jay had gone to London to negotiate a new treaty with Great Britain, which brings up a whole interesting separation of powers questions. But nonetheless, he goes to England and he negotiates this treaty and sent it back, and the Senate ratified it. And then it went to the House to raise the funds to do the different clauses that were required. And the treaty was very unpopular, especially in the South, especially with the new emerging Jeffersonian Republican contingent in the House. And so as a way to try and scuttle this treaty, the Republicans in the House request all executive papers pertaining to the negotiations around the treaty. And Washington, in his letter back, he reminds them that he had indeed complied with these requests in the past. And then he explains that diplomacy requires a certain level of secrecy in order for other nations to be willing to engage in these deliberations. Treaties don't happen if you see, how the sausage gets made. And what we would think of today as sort of national security concerns. He didn't use those words at the time, but that's sort of what he is suggesting. And so he says that that is a higher bar of secrecy that needs to be met, and he doesn't think that the Congressional Committee has met that bar. And then, of course, he draws some other important distinctions, which I'm sure we will talk about.
I think what's interesting about that, Lindsay, is, he's applying it to this very specific foreign policy matter, right? We don't want these negotiations, these delicate negotiations to leak out. And then over time, as executive privilege grows, that idea remains that the president needs to be able to have private conversations that are not subject to oversight. But as we have seen in recent decades, that then applies to just about every aspect of the presidency.
Absolutely. And with his response, he's recognizing that foreign actors need to have some guarantee of secrecy because American voters don't have really the right to oversee what, foreign actors are doing. But per, what your question, he distinguishes this standard request for papers and the importance of secrecy over diplomacy on this standard request, and one of impeachment. And he says if this were an impeachment inquiry, that would be a much higher bar that he would have to meet to keep things private, because Congress has this right to investigate wrongdoing. And it's really important that presidents comply with that. Now, I do believe he genuinely thought that there was a distinction, and he wanted to be sure that Congress understood that he would comply if it was this serious thing. But as to Kellie's comment, I also think that he was saying, here's my reputation. If you would like to impeach me, go for it. So it's really kind of calling their bluff and staking his position on the fact that they're not going to do that. There's just no way.
What is it, though, about this treaty that has him so protective? Or what agenda or motivation does he think he's trying to mask or protect?
So I think there are three key components. One, the Jeffersonian Republicans had a warped view of the United States' role in international commerce, according to Washington. They thought that the U.S. was way more important than it was, and so should therefore be able to demand much more favorable trade terms. And he was basically saying this treaty was the best that could be had, given that we have absolutely zero leverage. And so the fact that Jay got any concessions was a win. So he genuinely thought that it was worth having on the books. The second piece was he felt that this was maybe a little bit personal. It was certainly partisan, and he resented that partisan influence. He, of course, was opposed to parties. He resented the partisan influence coming into the treaty-making process. And the final piece, which is the last part of his letter as well, he did not think that the House of Representatives had a right to judge treaties. There is not a role for the House of Representatives in the Constitution in the treaty-making process. And he reminds them of that in spectacular fashion, saying that he was at the Constitutional Convention. He was there when these decisions were made. And if they don't believe him, he has the records from the convention sitting in the State Department offices, and they're welcome to come take a look. So it's like this ultimate mic drop, throwing of the gauntlet. And it's so sassy, and he's not usually sassy like this, which is one of the reasons it's one of my favorite letters. Yes, he's snarky, and he's not usually like that in letters to Congress, so I really love that.
Look, I want to just acknowledge that we're talking about, conversations with foreign leaders and secrecy and diplomacy, and then oversight and these threats of impeachment and these egotistical presidents, and the parallels are just screaming at us. We will get there. We will talk about Trump. But one more question that keeps us in this moment, just because there is an interesting wrinkle here that I'm curious your thoughts on. But, yes, Washington is sassy. He's bristling. He does seem very deliberative about this moment, too. And in particular, it looks like, he consults his cabinet before making this decision. And I can't help but notice that you wrote a book about Washington and his cabinet. But, how important is it that he's kind of like, is it kind of like, oh, you have your crew over there telling you can get in my business? Well, I have my crew too. And we say, butt out.
Yes, absolutely. So he consults with his cabinet before taking really any monumental step for the duration of his presidency once he convenes a cabinet for the first time on November 26th, 1791. And from that point forward, whenever he's going to make a really big precedent-setting decision, like executive privilege, he's really sure that he meets with them, he has their buy-in, he has understood all the potential ramifications. So it's very much a way to get advice and to get input and to get other ideas. But he also wants to make sure, especially in this case, that he has the unanimous approval of the cabinet before making this choice. Partly, I think, for political reasons, to ensure that he has some backup and he's, of covered. He's doing a little bit of CYA with this situation. But I think it's also a genuine desire to make sure he's not making a wrong choice. And if there had been disagreement in the cabinet about the legality of this choice or the, righteousness of his position in power, it would have given him serious pause.
All right, let's bring it to present or, other historical parallels and moments that this has come up. But, you recently wrote a piece. You wrote a piece about Trump and Barr and William Barr, and Barr specifically referring to this around these swirling questions of executive privilege. So, in the Trump administration, how has this continued to be a strand?
Well, I feel like we got a story every week about executive privilege. It was impossible to miss those words for years.
Someone just shouldn't have told Trump about executive privilege. Someone just like randomly walked in and sort of mentioned it, and it's just stuck in his head.
It's true.
Did you know?
No, it's so true. And I mean, I can't imagine he really did a whole lot of reading on the subject before coming in. So whoever told him that needed to not. What's so interesting in studying the initial usage of executive privilege, and I would say also executive privilege assertions really up until the 20th century, there were always limitations. There was always an understanding that public and congressional oversight is really important. We are not a dictatorship. We are not a monarchy. The president is not always right and is not all-knowing and all-powerful. And so you have to have some sort of way to check that authority. And if you can't investigate and look into what the president is doing, how do you check that authority? So that sort of initial concept is so central to Washington's decision and so absent from the Trump administration.
Well, and you see over the course of the 20th century, especially with the Cold War, that there's so much that the government does that becomes secret, that makes oversight more difficult. And there is this brief moment in the 1970s when Congress kind of comes roaring back during the Nixon era and says, wait a second, we need to be able to see presidential records. They can't be destroyed. We need to have much more oversight, and there need to be more limits to executive privilege and how it operates. But as we've seen, particularly with the war on terror, but I think even before then it was creeping back up, presidents really do have a lot of leeway when it comes to executive privilege. And this has become a real battleground in recent years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It has, and it is a tricky situation because there obviously are things that have to remain secret, or at least secret for a while to protect the identities of important sources and intelligence. And so I am in no way suggesting that there shouldn't be executive privilege, but Congress definitely needs, I think, to step that back up. And the relationship between that and the courts and their decisions on executive privilege is obviously a very complicated one. So I imagine this will continue to be a source of debate and contention going forward.
You may have just answered it, but, kind of where in that spectrum of boon times for executive privilege or, good times for oversight, do you see us, and are we shifting even in the couple years since the Trump presidency?
We're definitely shifting in the last couple years. I think partly because of the January 6th investigation. They have really challenged a lot of the claims of executive privilege that might have gone ignored or not challenged prior to that committee. And courts, to their credit, have said most of the claims are not based in legal reality or fact. So I'm hopeful that this investigation and Congress's desire to investigate the executive during the Trump administration will remind people that this really is an important part of their responsibilities, their duties, and that things like presidential records are really critical. I'm delighted to see that there was such good journalism on that whole story. That was such an important part of the oversight. So I am hopeful that we're going in the right direction. It's just there are obviously a lot of things on Congress and the president's plate at the moment. So
I'm sure there's a whole nother conversation to be had here about kind of how this intersects with executive orders as well, which is another place where there's these questions of sort of imperial presidency come up. But is it the case that, like with executive orders, people talk about them in theory as something they won't abuse until it becomes expedient? And, presidents across all ideological spectrums have done that. Is that sort of how you read the history of executive privilege as well?
There is definitely an element of that. There are some presidents that have made an attempt to be a little bit more transparent, but then they don't always necessarily stick to those initial proclamations of transparency. And it's an understandable question that you don't want to, one of the questions that was posed to Biden is if he waived executive privilege for certain of Trump's actions, would that set a dangerous precedent for him going forward or for his successors? So there is that question. And as you said, it is a bipartisan issue. It's definitely not one that is one party or the other. I think part of the issue, and this is similar true with executive orders, is so much of this stuff is unwritten and so much is untested in the courts. So we're often talking in theoretical terms. And it's really hard to know how to enforce something or whether or not a court would enforce something when there's no legal precedent to follow.
It's funny. I always think about George Washington because when I'm teaching him in my class, I use Erica Dunbar's book, Never Caught. And I talk about how he had enslaved people who ran away from him and he was sending out slave catchers to return them. But much of that practice, he also wanted to sort of keep off the books or under the table. Like, don't let people know that, like, while I'm fighting for freedom, I'm sending out slave catchers for people that have run away from me. I mean, there's like this hypocrisy that's also at play in terms of George Washington, the slaveholder, and how he wants to keep his reputation as a slaveholder who does not have slaves who run away as a part of his identity.
100%. And actually, it gets even sort of more complicated because Edmund Randolph, who was the first attorney general, was the one that originally warned him about the law on the books in Pennsylvania that would automatically manumit an enslaved person after 6 months. And so Washington came up with a plan to basically cycle people in and out of the president's house to ensure that the clock reset and they were never automatically manumitted, which would have been a press story and would have been a subject of interest. And he did not want that to be a topic of conversation.
Yeah, certainly.
We should just mention that the capital at the time was in Philadelphia and not in Washington.
Thank you.
DC,
And
so Pennsylvania law mattered a lot.
Yes, an essential fact.
And we should say too, George Washington is not committing a crime, but he's certainly operating against the spirit of the law, which is to just say, okay, as soon as, we hit close to 6 months, send these slaves back to Virginia so I can, start the clock all over again.
Definitely.
I mentioned Barr and the Trump administration went all the way back to executive privilege number 1, for precedent. Is that the one that people tend to go back to? Or are there other moments of executive privilege that have sort of served as now sort of precedent that people return to over and over?
Often when contemporary figures, and you all know this well, when contemporary figures reach back to the 18th century, they're often not doing it correctly. And so they might refer to things, but they're really sort of, destroying their original story or the intent behind that kind of action. So, I think sometimes Washington is referenced, but rarely in the spirit that he anticipated. More frequently, I think 20th century executive privilege is usually the ones that are used to justify this action, especially in the post-Nixon era when there has been a legal sense that the president can kind of do no wrong, even though that, Office of the Legal Counsel opinion was also something that's questionable and not really based in judicial findings. So I think it's mostly sort of late 20th century precedents that people tend to follow.
Because that's where you find the most expansive uses of presidential power.
Yes.
So that's where
It's
they
the
want
most
to look.
useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Washington did it is a little more convincing than but Nixon did it.
Fair.
True.
But anyway, we will leave it there. This is super fascinating. Lindsay Chervinsky, author of The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of American Institution, who also wrote a great piece in the Washington Post about all this and the Trump administration. Thank you so much for doing this. And you have a podcast?
I do. I co-host The Past, The Promise, The Presidency with the Center for Presidential History. It's available wherever you like to listen to your podcasts.
There you go. All right, so go check that out. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday. Odoo, Modern Management Made Simple.
Radiotopia. From